stop everything. Moments ago, during what was meant to be a routine White House press conference, something unexpected and explosive happened. A top U.S. official appeared to drop a bombshell, not in a classified briefing, not behind closed doors, but on live camera in front of the American people. It happened like this. At 10:17 a.m. Eastern, a statement dropped that immediately ignited a firestorm across political and media landscapes. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., speaking at a press conference that had already drawn national attention for unrelated remarks on healthcare policy, paused for emphasis, and then leveled a charge that sent ripples through both the Republican and Democratic corridors. They gave you $100 million, he said, looking directly into the cameras, his voice steady, almost accusatory. Big Pharma paid, and you took it. The room went silent for a beat. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of camera equipment. Then, as reporters realized the weight of the statement, phones lit up, microphones swung, and journalists began furiously typing and recording. Across social media, the moment exploded. Hashtags trending, live streams replaying the clip, news outlets scrambling to verify details. This wasn't just another political squabble. This was a moment that, depending on how it unfolded, could redefine the conversation about accountability, influence, and trust in the corridors of power. The context of the accusation is crucial. For years, critics of former President Donald Trump have highlighted his extensive fundraising, the opaque channels through which campaign and personal donations flowed, and his relationships with corporate and industry donors. The intersection of politics and finance has always been a tightrope, but Kennedy's statement thrusts the discussion into a new, explosive dimension. It was no longer theoretical. It was now framed as a direct personal allegation. Trump had accepted millions from pharmaceutical companies, allegedly influencing policy decisions that affected the lives of millions of Americans. Immediately, analysts began dissecting the statement. Was this hyperbole, as political rhetoric often is, or was there a kernel of factual evidence? From a media perspective, it was a goldmine. Breaking news alerts went out within minutes. Streaming channels adjusted schedules to cover the statement live, and political commentators began weighing the implications in real time. Social media users, both supporters and detractors of Trump, flooded platforms with reactions ranging from shock to skepticism, from outrage to outright denial. The story had gone viral before the first coffee had cooled in the East Coast newsrooms. Let's step back for a moment to examine why this statement carried such gravity. $100 million is not a trivial sum. In the context of political campaigns, personal wealth, and corporate influence, it is a staggering figure. For a former president, allegations of taking this sum from the pharmaceutical industry are not merely a headline. They implicate questions about public trust, potential conflicts of interest, and the very integrity of decision-making that affects public health. If substantiated, even partially, such a claim could influence legislation, trigger congressional inquiries, and provoke judicial scrutiny. This is not just a political scandal. This is an intersection of governance, law, and public perception that has rarely been so starkly illuminated in real time. Inside the Trump orbit, the reaction was immediate and, by all reports, frenzied. White House aides, former campaign staffers, and political strategists reportedly convened emergency meetings to assess the fallout. Emails were sent, phone lines were opened, and allies began coordinating talking points to mitigate the damage. According to sources, Trump himself was said to be seething, pacing, and dictating statements to his communications team while simultaneously engaging with his legal advisors. There was a palpable sense of urgency. Unlike other political controversies, this one carried both a narrative and a numerical weight. $100 million was quantifiable, tangible, and headline-grabbing. But let's also consider the broader implications. Kennedy's remark did not occur in a vacuum. It came at a moment when the American public's trust in institutions, government, corporations, healthcare agencies, is already fraught. A global pandemic, soaring drug prices, and contentious debates over healthcare accessibility have made Americans acutely aware of the stakes. To hear a claim that a former president allegedly accepted vast sums from pharmaceutical companies is not just political theater. For many citizens, it resonates with lived experiences. Families struggling to afford medications, patients questioning whether decisions were made for public good or private gain, and activists pushing for transparency in all corners of power. The historical context cannot be overstated. Previous allegations of corporate influence over elected officials have erupted into major national debates, but the scale Kennedy invoked, a direct personal allegation tied to a quantifiable figure, is rare. In past administrations, accusations of corporate funding were often veiled, generalized, or indirect. Here, Kennedy's approach was surgical, a direct accusation delivered with confidence on live national television in a format designed to reach millions simultaneously. It was a calculated strike designed to leave no room for ambiguity. Immediately following the statement, newsrooms went into high gear. Anchors across cable networks interrupted regular programming to analyze the implications. Panels of political analysts, former prosecutors, and healthcare experts weighed in on what the allegation meant legally, ethically, and politically. Questions emerged rapidly. Could there be a legal investigation? What evidence would support or refute such a claim? How might this impact Trump's standing within the Republican Party? Would this affect the broader 2026 election landscape? Every angle was being dissected live, with commentary ranging from cautious speculation to outright condemnation. And yet, in the midst of this storm, the human element is critical. Consider the viewers, millions of Americans absorbing this revelation on their televisions and devices. Families gathered around screens, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering theories to one another. Communities on social media debated and argued, posting videos, sharing articles, and connecting the dots with past controversies and campaign finance reports. Across the country, the reaction was visceral. People weren't just watching history unfold, they were feeling it. Anxiety, outrage, skepticism, and incredulity collided in real time, creating a uniquely intense emotional landscape that few political moments achieve. Meanwhile, inside political circles, reactions varied sharply along ideological lines. Democratic leaders seized on the statement to bolster calls for stricter campaign finance oversight and corporate accountability. Republican officials, on the other hand, faced a delicate balancing act: defend the former president and risk association with alleged misconduct, or distance themselves and potentially alienate core supporters. This tension underscored the gravity of Kennedy's words. They were not merely accusatory, they were catalytic, setting in motion a cascade of political, legal, and public dynamics. Kennedy's statement also reverberated internationally. Journalists in London, Berlin, and Tokyo picked up the story, framing it within broader concerns about transparency, governance, and global trust in American institutions. Analysts noted that allegations of such scale against a former president could influence foreign perceptions of U.S. policy decisions, pharmaceutical regulation, and corporate government relationships. In an interconnected world, the ripple effects extended far beyond domestic politics, touching on diplomacy, trade negotiations, and investor confidence in U.S. markets. Adding to the drama, the timing of the statement amplified its impact. Delivered during a period of heightened political scrutiny, following investigations into campaign finance, corporate lobbying, and high-profile public health decisions, the allegation arrived like a thunderclap. Media outlets scrambled not only to cover the content of the statement, but also to contextualize it within ongoing narratives. Previous Trump administration dealings, campaign contributions, and questions surrounding the influence of large corporations on federal policy. The timing was impeccable from a storytelling perspective, leaving audiences riveted and experts scrambling for clarity. But perhaps the most striking element of this moment was the confidence with which Kennedy delivered it. There was no hesitation, no qualifying language, no hedging. The phrase, "they gave you 100 million," was declarative, forceful, and designed to resonate. It was the kind of line that anchors repeat verbatim in headlines, that journalists quote across platforms, and that audiences remember. In effect, it transformed a broader discussion about corporate influence into a singular, personalized accusation, focusing attention squarely on Trump and the implications of accepting such funds. As the story unfolded, the immediate aftermath revealed layers of complexity. Fact-checkers began poring over campaign finance reports, tracing corporate donations, and reviewing public filings. Legal analysts dissected whether accepting such funds, if proven, could have constituted a violation of federal statutes governing campaign contributions, lobbying, or corporate influence. Political commentators debated the broader ethical implications. Meanwhile, social media acted as both a sounding board and an amplifier, with supporters defending Trump vigorously and critics citing Kennedy's statement as a turning point in public accountability. Inside the former president's circle, sources indicated heightened activity. Communications teams drafted statements, strategists prepared talking points, and legal advisors analyzed potential implications. The sense of urgency was palpable. According to insider reports, Trump himself reviewed the statement multiple times, dictating responses to aides while monitoring social media trends and news coverage. The rapid spread of the story ensured that every move, every word, and every tweet was under intense scrutiny. The morning after Kennedy's statement, the White House was in a state of controlled chaos. Staffers moved quickly, shuffling papers, making calls, drafting statements, all in an attempt to contain the fallout from what had instantly become the defining news cycle of the week. Donald Trump, according to multiple insider reports, had convened a series of private meetings with his closest advisors. The focus was singular: damage control. But the problem wasn't just the statement itself. The problem was the way it had gone viral, spreading across every corner of social media, every cable news channel, and even international media outlets. For a former president whose public image is as carefully curated as any global brand, this was more than a political challenge. It was a direct assault on credibility, influence, and power. Inside these meetings, aides reportedly urged calm, advising measured responses, carefully worded denials, and a focus on broader policy achievements. But Trump, as sources indicate, was agitated. According to one senior advisor, he paced the Oval Office, repeatedly asking, "How can they say that? How can they say I took $100 million?" The frustration was palpable. Every phone call, every news alert, every mention on Twitter seemed to compound the sense of crisis. In political terms, this was a lightning strike, sudden, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. Across Capitol Hill, the reverberations were immediate. Congressional offices were flooded with calls from constituents demanding answers. Democratic lawmakers seized the moment to push for hearings and investigations into campaign finance practices, pharmaceutical lobbying, and corporate influence over federal policy. "We cannot let these allegations go unanswered," one senior senator was quoted saying. If true, this strikes at the heart of public trust in our government. Republican lawmakers, on the other hand, were placed in a delicate position. Many expressed concern privately about the optics of defending a former president against a direct accusation of taking vast sums from Big Pharma. Some reportedly debated publicly addressing the claim, while others opted for silence, waiting for further developments. The political tension was mounting. Meanwhile, social media became a battleground of interpretation and outrage. Hashtags related to the statement began trending almost instantly. Supporters of Trump posted vehement defenses, calling Kennedy's claim a baseless attack, a political ploy designed to weaken a powerful figure. Critics of Trump celebrated the revelation as confirmation of long-standing suspicions about corporate influence in politics. Analysts watching the social media reaction noted the unprecedented speed at which the story spread. Within hours, millions of impressions had been recorded, and the statement had been shared, reposted, and discussed across multiple platforms. Public engagement was through the roof, and the story showed no signs of slowing. At the same time, mainstream media outlets scrambled to verify the details. Investigative journalists began digging into publicly available campaign finance records, corporate filings, and past interactions between the Trump administration and pharmaceutical companies. Legal analysts weighed in on the potential implications. Could the alleged acceptance of $100 million constitute a violation of federal law? Would this trigger congressional inquiries or even Department of Justice investigations? Even preliminary assessments suggested that, if verified, the claim could carry significant consequences. The narrative was no longer simply political commentary. It had crossed into the realm of institutional scrutiny. Internationally, the fallout was immediate and notable. Outlets in Europe and Asia picked up the story, framing it within broader discussions of transparency, governance, and the influence of private money on public office. Analysts in London, Berlin, and Tokyo noted that such an allegation, if substantiated, could impact U.S. credibility in global negotiations and multinational policy discussions, particularly those relating to healthcare regulation and pharmaceutical pricing. The claim cast a shadow over not just domestic policy, but the United States' international image as a regulator, negotiator, and leader in global public health. Adding to the pressure was the financial aspect of the allegation. $100 million is not a trivial figure in political finance. It represents both influence and leverage. If a former president were proven to have accepted such funds, it could fundamentally alter public perception of past policy decisions, regulatory approvals, and even pandemic-related pharmaceutical strategies. Critics immediately linked the sum to major decisions made during the Trump administration, arguing that accepting such donations, if true, created conflicts of interest that could have impacted countless Americans. As the hours passed, Trump's communications team rolled out a series of statements and interviews. The tone was defensive, urgent, and according to political analysts, sometimes contradictory. One statement emphasized that all donations were legal, properly reported, and unconnected to policy decisions. Another interview suggested that Kennedy's claim was politically motivated, designed to weaken Trump's influence ahead of upcoming political activities. Despite these efforts, the narrative had already taken root. The public had seen the quote, heard the tone, and formed initial impressions that were difficult to retract or reshape. By the afternoon, newsrooms began compiling timelines of Trump's interactions with pharmaceutical companies, tracing campaign contributions, speaking engagements, and lobbying contacts. Analysts noted patterns and potential connections, and questions arose about whether corporate contributions influenced policy decisions, regulatory approvals, or other executive actions. Every day since the statement, new threads emerged, linking past actions to the potential implications of Kennedy's claim. For journalists, this was a story that would unfold over weeks, if not months, as evidence, testimonies, and documents were examined. In parallel, public demonstrations and digital activism surged. Advocacy groups, activists, and concerned citizens organized virtual campaigns, petitions, and protests, calling for transparency, accountability, and investigations. Social media campaigns pushed hashtags and videos to trend, reaching audiences far beyond traditional news consumers. The immediacy of the claim, coupled with its clarity, $100 million, created a tangible anchor for activism and public discourse. For many, it was a wake-up call, a vivid reminder of the intersection of money, influence, and governance. Politically, the strategic implications were massive. For Republican leadership, the allegation posed a dilemma: defend the former president and risk further association with alleged misconduct, or distance themselves and potentially alienate a significant portion of the base. Democrats, by contrast, seized on the opportunity to highlight corporate influence, promote legislation for transparency, and underscore concerns about campaign finance. Legal teams began examining the framework of potential investigations, including the feasibility of tracing funds, evaluating compliance with federal campaign finance laws, and assessing whether regulatory decisions could have been unduly influenced by corporate contributions. Inside the Trump campaign and advisory network, sources reported high tension. Lawyers were reviewing the statement, communications teams were drafting talking points, and public relations advisors were coordinating rapid responses. The former president himself, according to insiders, was closely monitoring developments, weighing options, and dictating statements. The sense of urgency was intensified by the fact that the allegation had already achieved global reach, shaping both domestic and international narratives. Meanwhile, Kennedy's statement itself became a focal point of analysis. Political scientists, legal experts, and financial analysts examined both the veracity and the implications. Questions proliferated. Could Kennedy provide evidence to substantiate the claim? How might the Department of Justice or Federal Election Commission respond? Was there potential for bipartisan inquiry? Every expert weighed in, drawing lines between public perception, legal precedent, and political consequence. By evening, the intensity had not abated. Cable networks hosted marathon panels dissecting every word of Kennedy's statement, linking it to historical campaign finance controversies and discussing potential repercussions. Social media campaigns continued to trend, and international coverage expanded. European news outlets highlighted concerns about transparency in U.S. governance. Asian financial media connected the allegation to broader questions about global corporate influence and regulatory integrity. The story had moved beyond partisan politics and into the realm of institutional consequence. For the public, the experience was visceral. Millions of Americans were following developments live, sharing insights, and debating ramifications. Community forums, local news segments, and digital town halls became arenas for discussion, reflection, and opinion. The narrative was no longer abstract. Kennedy's words, $100 million from Big Pharma, were tangible, immediate, and emotionally resonant. Families, voters, and activists alike felt the gravity, realizing that allegations of this scale touch on ethics, governance, and the very accountability mechanisms that underpin democratic institutions. By the second day, investigative teams in newsrooms had begun filing requests for public records, campaign contribution logs, and corporate filings. Legal experts were preparing for potential congressional inquiries, assessing the statutory frameworks for corporate donations, lobbying influence, and conflict of interest concerns. Analysts debated whether Trump's alleged acceptance of funds could constitute a violation of campaign finance law, federal anti-corruption statutes, or ethical regulations governing the executive branch. The scope of the inquiry, if formalized, promised to be comprehensive, extending beyond domestic politics into corporate compliance, lobbying oversight, and international regulatory implications. Even as the story dominated media cycles, it also became a case study in crisis communications. Political consultants highlighted the challenges of responding to allegations that are both quantifiable and public, emphasizing the speed at which narratives now travel in the digital age. Every statement, denial, or rebuttal was dissected instantly, often before legal verification or internal review. The lesson was stark. In the era of social media and 24-hour news, the initial public perception can shape political and legal realities before facts are fully established. By the close of the second day, the story had settled into multiple overlapping narratives. On one hand, there was the allegation itself, stark and direct. $100 million from Big Pharma. On the other hand, there were responses, defensive, strategic, and at times contradictory. Journalists continued to verify facts, activists amplified public pressure, and lawmakers assessed the potential political consequences. For the American public, it was a reminder of both the power and the fragility of democratic institutions, how allegations, evidence, and perception can converge to create a moment of national reckoning.